This is Georgia's beautiful coast, the most protected stretch of marshland on America's eastern seaboard, a safe haven for nesting birds, and home to healthy, nutrient-rich water that harbors a perfect growing environment for this shelled Georgia-grown gem. Ernest McIntosh Sr. and Jr. have been farming these Georgia oysters for several years under the company name E.L. McIntosh and Son Seafood, continuing a long family line of seafood production coming from these McIntosh County marshes.
It's a blessing to have someone to be able to carry it on. It make me feel like all what I've done in life, that it would continue going on.
You know, I've been raised in the commercial crabbing, and this is something we challenged to win at together. We got this opportunity, and it was like, I guess we were kind of like a two-headed man, you know. We was all together at the same thing. Oysters are a big part of clean water, clean air. One of these oysters filters, a big one, 50 gallons a day, so I mean, it's a good thing for us, and I wish there was more people interested in it than it is for the state, and I imagine we'll get there.
Oyster farming is something it's just something different. It's work, but it's altogether different from what I've been doing over the years. Me and him butt heads sometime, but I have to listen to him because he's got a younger mind, and a lot of time he hit me with this new technology stuff, and it all works out.
These here are market ready. These will be the first one out of the farm when the season reopens.
You got to work to get looking like this now. This oyster is up off the bottom. It's not in the mud. It's oysters in racks and bags and stuff like that, and they filter clean water all the time. It's not filtering that mud. So the bacteria is much lesser in this oyster when you're growing it in the water column.
You ain't gonna just put this animal out there and expect for it to just go on its own, because it's not gonna be pretty. We keep a 3-day minimum a week out here with these guys, sometimes 4 days. And if you're trying to make a living at it and you want to be successful, you're gonna stay out here on this water behind. A wild spat is any farmer's worst nightmare. That is a wild oyster larvae. So what that does is when the tide goes out, certain time of season, that wild oyster will put out that larvae. And as the tide goes out, it try to hold on to something before the water leaves it. So whatever it latches on there, it'll sit there and it'll grow. So you can imagine the millions of that in the water, and it hit one of these little bags here and attached to these little guys, and now you got a box here. You got a bag of oysters, or reef rather. You can't do nothing with it. But the opportunities is how much you want to work at it and be a good farmer, you know. If it ever gets that bad, you're not really interested in being a farmer.
These oysters look different than what you may be used to seeing. There's a golden brown glaze along the outer shell, and they are harvested individually, not clumped. And this is all by design. It's the result of a team of researchers, biologists, farmers, and chefs all sharing information, long hours, and a team passion for this amazing creature. Just a couple of counties north of Harris Neck lies Skidaway Island, home of the UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant, the birthplace of Georgia's first oyster hatchery. Tom Bliss is the director of UGA's Shellfish Research Lab and guides a dedicated team that is pioneering Georgia's oyster aquaculture.
We work with the oyster's natural cycle, so we bring the oysters in the spring, we conduct a spawn. Once they've spawned, we have to fertilize the eggs and then take care of the larvae all the way through their larval period until they become oysters, which they do during their setting period. So here in Georgia, our oysters grow in the intertidal, which causes them to grow tightly bound together in clumps. Those clumps are excellent for roast, but they're hard to break apart into single oysters that individuals like to be able to eat at a restaurant. So therefore, we've started adopting practices that have been developed elsewhere to grow them as a single oyster for wider distribution and actually easier to eat in many ways. And so to do that, you have to go to a more gear-intensive industry and use hatchery-produced oyster seed to make it a much easier process. Every oyster grown takes on the flavor of the water that it's in. So an oyster here from Georgia can look the same, but it can have a completely different taste than one from South Carolina or Virginia or the Gulf.
Justin Manley is the hatchery manager here on Skidaway and has played a major role in revolutionizing Georgia's oyster industry. He carefully watches over their maturity from spawn to the first several months of growth, a fascinating process to say the least.
We are trying to provide economic growth and stability to the industry. Seed forms the foundation of the oyster industry, and that's one thing the University of Georgia Marine Extension Georgia Sea Grant is trying to do, is help provide growers a stable environment to invest in developing their businesses. What we're doing right now is we're spawning oysters to produce oyster larvae. In nature, oysters are mass spawners, so they'll broadcast spawn eggs and sperm into the water column. And in the water column, fertilization occurs. And now I'm adding some live sperm to see if we can get something. The oysters will develop 14 to 21 days until they become competent. During this time, they develop an eye. They're about 200 microns in size. And they'll look for an adult oyster or some other form of substrate to settle on. What we do here is we spawn the oysters artificially using something called thermal induction, which is changing the water temperature from cold to hot, simulating a spring condition, which is a cue to them, a biological cue that they need to start spawning. So this is where we bring oysters to grow them here in the upland before they're moved out to growers in the field. So you can see how the water's coming through. You can't really see through it very well. It's because we have only a handful of oysters in this silo. We have about 50,000, okay? You can see they're a lot smaller than some of the other oysters we have in this upweller. These are larger oysters. They're able to clear that water out relatively quickly because of their size and their density, because oysters are filter feeders. What we're doing here is we are upwelling these oysters right now, so we're bringing raw water in from the estuary in through our tanks, and then it's returned back to the ocean again. It's bringing in oxygen and plenty of phytoplankton so they can grow. These oysters right here are for one of our growers, Ernest McIntosh, McIntosh and Son. They're currently our only oyster farmer. This is all his. I think we've got a little over 1 million oysters right here in this upweller at this time.
An oyster is indeed a shellfish, a living creature that needs to feed. And though they seem unaware and lifeless at first glance, there's a fascinating process that goes into feeding them appropriately. That's where Rob Hine comes into the story, along with his giant, bubbling, fluorescent tubes of algae.
It's very similar to horticulture. We just take small amounts of the algae and we'll move them into a larger vessel and add nutrients. Very similar how you would take a small plant that's getting a little root bound and you'd repot it into a bigger pot with more room, more soil, and then you would need to fertilize it as well. This is the same species of algae in different densities, and as the algae grows more and more, it becomes more and more dense, and so you can actually see the color change. So these are ready to either be fed or to be transferred into a larger size vessel like the one behind me. The exact growing region of an oyster does impact the flavor of the oyster and the quality of the oyster, which probably does have something to do with the native algae strains in that particular region.
Oysters naturally grow in clumps, creating giant fish-feeding mounds of shells all around these pristine marshlands and fluctuating tides, So growing these oysters individually and safe from predators is a challenge this team takes on every day. They learn the do's and don'ts the hard way, through experience, trial and error. So the farmer has fewer challenges on their end, in turn creating a more profitable product.
We're researching this to make it easier for people that are interested in it to get started in it. We've made a few mistakes ourselves, and it's very valuable to pass that information on to someone that might be wanting to get into it so they don't lose all their investment.
Rob, Justin, and the UGA Oyster Hatchery team keep a close relationship with the McIntoshes. These shellfish begin life on Skidaway, are then moved to the marshlands of McIntosh County in the good hands of the McIntosh oyster farming family, and from there, grown to perfection.
UGA gave us seeds, and we actually wanted to make those seeds grow. We failed a little bit, and once we caught on to how to make that oyster grow and make it look real good, it hadn't stopped since.
So as the industry grows, our hope is that we can help facilitate the growth of the commercial aspect, not only in the farming aspect, but also on the hatchery side.
It's an exciting yet challenging industry, but this team has come quite far and learned so much. Teamed with dedicated scientists and honest, hardworking farmers like the McIntoshes, the future is bright for an industry for these remarkable Georgia-born creatures. And though Ernest has yet to discover a pearl in one of these gold glaze shells, perhaps the real gem is the oyster itself.
If you grow something and you're afraid to eat it yourself, then how you think other people gonna feel? So they got certain months with it, but I know what I'm growing and how I'm taking care of it. It's salty.
Once they grow out right, I'm worse than a kid in a candy store when a beautiful one comes out the bunch. I love them.